Ooh. Special effects, somebody's plucking their eye out with us. Maybe that was the hand getting cut off, I don't know. Who here has cut their hand off? We take the Bible literally, don't we? Didn't Jesus say you must pluck your eye out if it causes you to sin, or cut your hand off if it causes you to sin? Don't we take the Bible literally? Isn't that what we should be doing? Now, if Jesus is saying that to make a point, maybe we can take this whole context and start to think, maybe Jesus is saying some things to make a point so that we understand him better. So why on one hand do we go, I don't really need to cut my hand off or pluck my eye out, that's okay. But on the other hand, we take the passage about leaving your offering at the altar and going home as, yes, that's something we should certainly be doing. Do you understand how long it would have taken some of the pilgrims to get to do their sacrifice? It might have taken them 2 days to get there. So for Jesus to turn around and say, okay, now turn around and go home before you come back, leave your thing at the altar, do you think your sacrifice is going to get worshipped in the 5 days that you're gone? You know, the 2 that it takes to get back, and then the 2 that and then whatever it takes to sort it out, and then to get back there again. Do you think the offering's still going to be sitting there waiting for you? No. Maybe Jesus is exaggerating to make a point. That sounds a bit scary for us because we don't want to think that that's a possibility. And if Jesus is saying that in those 2 instances, maybe he's taking it a step further as well. So what is the underlying lesson that Jesus is trying to give us here? Because Jesus in the previous week said, I have come to complete the law. In other passages of the Bible, Jesus says, my yoke is easy, but my burden is light. So if that means if we even look at another person in a sexual way we've committed adultery, how is that making our yoke easier? Isn't that just pouring more condemnation on top of us and making our yoke harder? Doesn't that make our life more difficult? Not make it easier? It doesn't really match, does it? And I've always found that when we read things in the Bible that don't match, God is a God of common understanding. So if they don't match, it's to do with our understanding of what we're understanding that doesn't match, not God. God always evens up. God always matches. So Jesus might be saying something other than what we think in these few passages that he's talking about here. Because I don't think Jesus is giving us another set of rules to follow. Do you think Jesus is adding a greater depth to the rules that were there? Is that what Jesus went around doing? Is that what we see him doing elsewhere in the Bible? Does anyone see him adding more rules for us elsewhere in the Bible? No, he doesn't. He does the opposite. When people say to him, what's the greatest commandment? He boils it all down into one and says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and your neighbour as yourself. Love is the greatest commandment. That's it. That's what, and he says, and all of the rules, all of the commandments hang off of this one thing. That's what he boils it down to. It's not a cuddly, nicey-wicey kind of love. It's a giving your heart and soul and life to something. Jesus wasn't giving us another set of rules to follow, another degree of difficulty. He was using hyperbole to make a point, to take something to an extreme to make a point. Now, we all admit that, but we don't want to really admit it out loud, because no one here has plucked out their eye or cut off their hand. So we all like to admit that, yes, in that verse it was hyperbole, but in all these others that are all said at the same time, talking about, I believe, the same topic, Jesus, they weren't hyperbole, they were rules that we have to have and the rules that we have to put in place so that we don't do and cross the line and break the rules that Jesus gave to us. Maybe all of these passages need to be taken together. So then, if we're talking about passages where Jesus is talking about being angry with someone and making amends, about something that causes you to sin and not doing it, and going to an extreme of not doing it, maybe Jesus is saying something else to us. Some Christians even go to the point where they won't take any vows. They won't take an oath to anyone. I don't know how you do that and end up being married, because one of the most important marriage things that you do is to make a vow to someone. You know, that's what we call a covenant or a contract. When you say, I choose to love, honour, protect, in sickness and in health, all those things, you're actually saying, I am going to do this and I'm going to stick with it. And I'm going to do the best I can to make this work. Why are there some Christians out there who condemn someone because they got divorced? Because I think sometimes they forget that this was all said together at the same time. Jesus said anger equals murder. Does anyone actually believe that anger equals murder? Does anyone here actually believe that that's what Jesus was saying? That anger actually equals murder? Or that lust actually equals adultery? No, what Jesus is saying is this will take you down to the wrong path. If you start heading down in this direction, then you could end up in the wrong place. If you spend a life as an angry person, constantly angry about everything that happens, it could get to an extreme where you could end up being at the point where you take someone's life. If you just look in the wrong direction and start to think the things that you shouldn't be thinking, that can head you down the wrong direction. I think Jesus was more likely saying, you know what, it's probably not a good idea, if you're a man, to go out and have a lunch date with someone of the opposite sex that's not your wife, because it might head you in the wrong direction. You might think it's all innocent and okay, but it could make you start to think about alternatives. And then it becomes more than a lunch date. And then it becomes conversations about deeper matters that perhaps you should be having with your wife and not with a stranger. Jesus is saying, don't even start heading in that direction. He's using hyperbole to make a point. He's saying, don't even start thinking about those things. Instead, be people who are faithful. Instead, be people who keep your word. Instead, be people who aren't angry. Instead, make amends with your brother before you even head to the synagogue to make your sacrifice. Make amends with them before you go. Be a person who doesn't hold grudges. Be a person who doesn't even go down in that direction in the first place, is what Jesus, I believe, is saying in this place. If you look at what all of this says, I think a lot of this is talking about marriage. I don't know what was going on at that time that made Jesus want to talk about marriage so much, but he talks about keeping vows. He talks about lust. He talks about anger. He talks about divorce. He talks about all these things together. He doesn't take them out in isolation. This is something he's talking about at one point in one time, and I think he's actually addressing what it means to be married. Sorry for those of you who aren't married, you might not be too interested in, what this has to say, but he is making some clear guidelines. And again, we need to understand context when we talk about marriage. What we think about marriage in the 21st century in Switzerland is very different to marriage in the 1st century Jerusalem. Do we understand that? Do we get that? It is a very different thing. How many women here were told who they had to marry? Put your hand up if you're a married woman and you were told you had to marry this person. No, sorry, that might embarrass you. Maybe you better not put your hand up. But generally, we find that's not the case, is it? We marry for love. We don't marry because we were told that we had to marry someone. Do you know that Mary and Joseph, that were quite likely that Mary was about 15 years old and Joseph was probably in his 30s? It was an arranged marriage. They would have been told who they were going to marry. Do you know that a woman was considered property of the man? When Jesus talks about divorce, do you know that a woman had no chance of getting a divorce? A woman couldn't make a divorce, only a man could, because the woman was the property of the man. A woman couldn't work, couldn't earn money, couldn't own property, couldn't own a business, couldn't do all sorts of different things without her husband. So by a husband divorcing a woman, you're basically making her destitute, which leaves her really only one form of income, which turns into the oldest profession that we know. That's all she's got left. That's all she's got left to turn to, because she's got no other way of even eating or living or surviving. Did you know that a husband of this time could write a letter of divorce because his wife burnt his dinner? For any reason, basically. If he just decided he's had enough, he could just say, I divorce you. You're done. On to the next one. Come on, where's the next wife? Because women had no say. They had no power. When we think about marriage and divorce in 21st century terms and overlay that into a 1st century context, we do the Bible injustice. When Jesus is talking about divorcing somebody at the drop of a hat, he's not talking about two people who say, you know what, it's not working out, maybe we should go our separate ways. I don't think Jesus would be happy with that either. Now, this is where I do want to see a show of hands. Who here is married? Put your hand up if you're married or been married. Okay, who's been married for longer than 5 years? Longer than 10 years? Longer than 15 years? Longer than 20 years? Longer than 25 years? I'm out. Okay, now those of you with your hands still up, has every day been a paradise and been easy? Thank you. You can put your hands down now. Marriage is not always easy. It's not always a bed of roses. I know it's Rose Day coming up soon, Valentine's Day. It's just another way of selling chocolate and cards. I didn't think the Swiss needed more ways to sell chocolate, but we certainly advertise Valentine's Day just as heavily here as everywhere else in the world. I'm not a big fan of it. We don't celebrate Valentine's Day in our house because we consider our wedding anniversary more important than Valentine's Day. But we acknowledge it. We acknowledge that it's happening, and that's okay. We shouldn't need a reason to tell our spouse that we love them. It should be a part of life. But sometimes being married to someone is flippin' hard work. Can you imagine trying to be married to me? That would be one of the hardest things you could possibly do. My wife is a saint. It isn't always easy, and it takes work and it takes effort. So the last thing I want anyone to hear me say is divorce is okay, go off and get divorced if you just don't feel like it anymore. But however, I think we do the Bible an injustice if we say that the Bible is completely against divorce under any circumstances. I think that's wrong. And I think the Bible even tells us that's wrong. So the ideal is that we should stay true to our marriage vows and we should make something work. My father was a cabinet maker, and he firmly believed that you buy good quality tools and you maintain them. When they break, you repair them and you keep them going. You don't buy cheap junk and then expect it to last forever. He said it's the same with employees. If you have an employee that's not doing well, you give them more training, you give them more help, and you train them up so that they can be better employees. It's the same with a marriage relationship. If you put the effort into it to maintain it, to make it work, to keep it going, then it will last you the long haul. If you buy a car and you never service it, you never maintain it, you never oil it, you never do all the things you need to do to look after a car, after 20 years, do you think the car's going to be doing very well at the time? No, but we seem to think you can get married and then just magically everything will just keep going fine after that. You need to work on a marriage to make it work. But the Bible clearly gives an opportunity where there is a time that divorce is a possibility. We've already said that women couldn't divorce a man. Only a man could divorce a woman in this stage. So Jesus is actually doing something very countercultural here, saying, guys, you can't just divorce your wife because you burnt your dinner. You can't just get rid of her at the drop of a hat. And in fact, they couldn't even consider that a man could commit adultery. It had to have been the woman who committed adultery. Remember the woman who was caught in adultery and brought in front of Jesus? Where was the man? They couldn't conceive of the fact that a man could do such a thing. Because men don't do that kind of thing, do they? Jesus allows divorce for unfaithfulness. This passage says so. He allows for the opportunity for divorce for unfaithfulness. Paul allows it for a spouse who's been abandoned. If you're abandoned by an unbelieving partner, then Paul allows for divorce. Moses allowed it for broken vows, or what we could consider abuse. Now, would we truly expect a woman who is being beaten by her husband to stay with that person and make it work? Is she meant to say, thank you, sir, may I have another? Or do we say,